The wind howled through the shattered concrete, carrying the stench of copper and dust. Her optic was dead. Shattered glass. 2,000 yards out, the executioner raised his blade. "No scope, no chance," the spotter scoffed. But they forgot one thing. She didn't need a lens to see the math. The tar paper on the roof was melting. Casey could feel it through the elbows of her combat shirt. A slow, viscous heat that smelled like a chemical fire. It was 112 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. They had been on this rooftop for 34 hours. Next to her, Donovan shifted. The faint crinkle of his uniform sounded like a gunshot in the dead, heavy air. He was a slab of a man, built for kicking down doors in Fallujah a lifetime ago, not baking on a ruined tenement in a nameless Syrian border town. He was her spotter. He was also a skeptic, not because she was a woman, though the brass had certainly wrung their hands over a female SEAL holding the long gun, but because Donovan didn't believe in anything he couldn't break with his own hands. He trusted volume of fire. He trusted frag grenades. He did not trust a piece of glass and a mathematics equation to save the day when the world went to hell. "Drink," Donovan muttered, sliding the tube of his camelback toward her. "I'm good," Casey whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. Sand coated her throat, her teeth, the inside of her nostrils. "You're dehydrated. Your pulse will spike. Drink the damn water, Morgan." She didn't take her eye off the optic. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope, the world was magnified, compressed into a circle of heat mirage and ruined architecture. 1,400 meters away sat a concrete compound, stripped of paint, flanked by the skeletal remains of what used to be a hospital. "Target building is still quiet," Casey said, ignoring the water. Donovan exhaled, a slow hiss through his teeth. "Intel is garbage. Again. We've been burning alive for 2 days for a ghost." The ghost was a mid-level facilitator who went by the moniker The Broker. He wasn't a fighter. He was an accountant of human misery. He bought captured Westerners from local militias and sold them to the highest bidder for slick, high-definition execution videos. Right now, according to a satellite intercept that cost the taxpayers 7 figures, the broker was holding an undercover DEA agent in the basement of that compound. The assault force, a joint task force of rangers and indigenous friendlies, was stacked up in a dry wadi 3 miles south. They were waiting for the word. But they couldn't move until Casey and Donovan had eyes on the courtyard. If the broker wasn't there, the raid would blow months of covert tracking for an empty basement. Casey adjusted her grip on the Mark 13 Mod 7 rifle. The heavy barrel was hot to the touch. The weapon was chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. It was a sledgehammer of a gun, capable of reaching out and ending a life before the sound of the blast even arrived. But at 1,400 meters, it wasn't just about pointing and shooting. It was physics. It was the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the earth beneath the bullet as it flew. It was spin drift. It was the barometric pressure, the humidity, the temperature of the powder inside the brass casing. She loved the math. The math was pure. The military was messy, full of egos and bad radios and politicians in air-conditioned rooms drawing lines on maps. But gravity didn't care about politics. Wind didn't care about gender. The bullet only did exactly what you told it to do. "Check your 6, Donovan murmured, his eye pressed to his spotting scope. Dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast, 3 vehicles. Casey shifted the rifle by a fraction of an inch, scanning left. The bipod squeaked faintly. 3 Toyota Hilux trucks, caked in mud, tore down the ruined highway towards the compound. Men with rifles bristled in the beds. "I have them," Casey said. Her heart rate, despite the heat, dropped into a slow, steady rhythm. This was the switch. the transition from agonizing boredom to hyper-lethal focus. The trucks skidded to a halt inside the compound's walls. Dust washed over the courtyard. Armed men spilled out, establishing a perimeter. They were nervous, jerky movements, scanning the sky for drones. Then the back door of the lead truck opened. A man stepped out. He wore a crisp, clean polo shirt, utterly out of place in the apocalyptic landscape. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a satellite phone. "Confirm target," Donovan said, his voice tightening. The cynicism was gone, replaced by the cold professionalism of an operator going to work. Casey stared through the glass. The heat mirage made the man look like he was underwater, rippling and distorting. She focused on the face, the distinct jawline, the slight limp in his left leg. "Target confirmed, it's the broker." "Command, this is Vulture 1-1, Donovan spoke softly into his boom mic. "Jackpot. Target is on site. You are clear to advance," static hissed in Casey's earpiece. Then, the voice of the assault force commander. "Copy, Vulture. We are moving. ETA to breach is 4 mics. Keep the roof clear. 4 minutes, 240 seconds. Casey dialed the elevation turret on her scope. "Give me a wind read, Donnie." "Wind is left to right. 5 miles an hour at the muzzle. Picking up in the valley. Call it 10 miles an hour at the target. Half value." "Holding left edge," Casey said. Her finger rested against the curved metal of the trigger. Not pulling, just feeling the weight. Down in the courtyard, the broker gestured to 2 of his men. They jogged to the basement doors of the hospital. A minute passed. The heavy iron doors swung open. They dragged a man out into the blinding sunlight. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. The DEA agent. He stumbled, his knees buckling, but the guards hauled him upright, dragging him toward the center of the courtyard. "Things are moving fast," Donovan warned. "They're setting up a camera." Casey saw it. A tripod. A digital camera. The broker was standing over the kneeling agent, drawing a long, curved blade from a sheath at his hip. He wasn't going to wait for the auction. The raid must have been compromised. He was cutting his losses and taking the propaganda victory. "Command, Vulture. Be advised, target is prepping an execution. We do not have 4 mics. Requesting green light to initiate. Static. Vulture, hold fire. Do not initiate. The assault element is still 2 miles out. If you miss, they kill the package. If you hit, the perimeter guards kill the package. Hold your fire." "He's going to cut his head off right now," Donovan snarled into the mic. "I need a green light." "Negative, Vulture. Hold." Casey watched the broker test the edge of the blade against his thumb. The agent on his knees was weeping, his head bowed. "Screw the brass," Casey said, her voice dead flat. "I'm taking him." Donovan looked at her, his eyes wide. Disobeying a direct hold-fire order on a high-value hostage rescue was a career-ender. It was Leavenworth material. But Donovan looked down at the courtyard, saw the blade catch the sun, and nodded. "Send it," Casey exhaled, letting all the air out of her lungs. The crosshairs settled perfectly on the center of the broker's chest. She applied pressure to the trigger. 3 pounds, 4 pounds. Then the world exploded. The concussive wave hit them before the sound did. An RPG, fired from a flanking rooftop, a mere block away, slammed into the floor directly beneath them. The tenement groaned like a dying animal. Concrete pulverized into blinding white dust. The shockwave picked Casey up and threw her sideways. The heavy Mark 13 rifle clattered against the low parapet. Ears ringing with a high, piercing whine, Casey tasted blood. She coughed, rolling onto her hands and knees. The dust was so thick it was like swimming in milk. "Donnie," she choked out. "Here." A rough hand grabbed her shoulder, pulling her flat. "Incoming." A furious chatter of AK-47 fire raked the top of their building. Chunks of cinder block rained down on them. A patrol had spotted their glint or tracked their insertion. They were pinned. Casey scrambled blindly toward her rifle. Her fingers found the hot metal barrel. She dragged it toward her, keeping her head lower than the knee-high wall. "We're compromised!" Donovan was screaming into the radio, over the din of automatic fire. "Command, Vulture is taking heavy fire. Local perimeter is alerted." "Vulture, assault element is halted. They have roadblocks. You are on your own. What is the status of the package?" Casey hauled herself up to a kneeling position, bracing the rifle against a crumbling brick pillar. She threw her eye behind the scope to check the courtyard. She saw nothing. Not dust, not mirage, nothing. Just a spiderweb of opaque, fractured lines. She blinked, wiping her eye, thinking it was sweat or blood. She looked again. A piece of shrapnel from the RPG blast had caught the objective lens of the Schmidt and Bender. The glass was entirely shattered, a mosaic of dead, useless crystal. The internal tube was dented. The scope was completely and utterly destroyed. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her training. "My glass is gone," she said. Donovan stopped shooting his M4 for a fraction of a second, looking at her. "What?" "The optic is destroyed. I have no scope." Donovan cursed violently. He keyed his mic. "Command, Vulture is black on optics. Primary weapon is blind. I repeat, the long gun is out of the fight. Down in the courtyard, 1,400 meters away, the gunfire from the town had caused a panic." The broker was shouting, waving the knife. The camera was knocked over. The guards were dragging the DEA agent toward a heavy, armored SUV. If they got him in that truck, he was gone. He would be dead in an hour in a ditch somewhere. "They're moving the package," Casey said, her voice tight. "It's over," Donovan yelled over a fresh burst of incoming fire. "We're blind, we're pinned, and the assault element is blocked. Pack it up, Morgan. We need to break contact and get off this roof before they overrun us." Casey stared at the useless glass on her rifle. A 1,400-meter shot, nearly a mile. It was a shot that required absolute precision, a clear picture, and precise magnification. "I can make it," she said. Donovan looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Are you deaf? You have no scope. The zero is gone. The glass is dead. You cannot shoot a mile with a broken gun." "I'm not using the scope." Casey reached up and grabbed the quick-detach levers on the scope mount. She snapped them open. With a hard wrench, she pulled the $5,000 piece of optics off the top rail of the rifle and tossed it onto the tar paper. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Donovan stopped firing entirely. He stared at the bare rail of her weapon. "Morgan, what the hell are you doing?" She reached to the front of the rail and flipped up the backup iron sight. A tiny flip-up post meant for a last-ditch firefight at maybe 50 yards. She flipped up the rear peep sight. "No scope, no chance," Donovan mocked, the cynicism boiling over into desperation. "It's a mile out. You're going to hit the hostage. You're going to miss by 30 feet. Don't be a hero, Casey. It's physically impossible." "Nothing is impossible. It's just math." Casey ignored the bullets snapping overhead. She ignored the blood trickling from her nose. She closed her eyes for a second, pulling up the dope card in her mind. 1,400 meters, with a 220-grain bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The bullet drop would be immense. At that range, the bullet would fall roughly 600 inches, 50 feet of drop. With a scope, you dialed the turret to compensate. With iron sights, she had to aim in the sky. She had to aim over the target's head by the height of a 4-story building. "Give me the wind, Donnie, right now." Her voice wasn't a request. It was an absolute command. It carried a strange, eerie calm that cut right through the chaos of the firefight. Donovan swallowed hard. He looked through his spotting scope, ignoring the suppressive fire chewing up their cover. He looked at the mirage, at the dust kicking up in the courtyard far below. "Wind is full value now," Donovan said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping back into the pure, detached role of the spotter. "Crosswind, right to left. 15 miles an hour. It's howling down there." 15 miles an hour. At 1,400 meters, the wind would push the bullet sideways by over 12 feet. 50 feet high, 12 feet to the right. Casey wedged the stock of the rifle deep into her bruised shoulder pocket. She pressed her cheek tightly against the comb. She looked through the tiny rear aperture, focusing on the front post. The target, the broker, was just a microscopic speck of a pixel in the distance. He was shoving the orange-clad hostage into the open door of the SUV. He was standing still for exactly 1 second. Casey shifted the rifle. She elevated the barrel, aiming at a blank patch of blue sky far above the compound. She shifted right, aiming at the empty air beside the hospital ruins. "You're aiming at the moon," Donovan whispered, terrified. "I'm aiming at the math," she replied. She took a breath in. The heat, the smell of cordite, the burning tar. She let the breath out. Halfway out, she paused. Her body turned to stone. The world went completely silent. She applied 4 pounds of pressure. The trigger broke cleanly. There was no Hollywood boom, just the vicious, ear-splitting crack of the primer igniting the powder, instantly followed by the violent rearward slam of the rifle into Casey's shoulder. The muzzle brake vented a V-shaped blast of superheated gas, kicking up a blinding cloud of pulverized concrete and tar dust from the rooftop. For a fraction of a second, the heavy Mark 13 obscured her vision entirely. But Casey didn't flinch. She kept her cheek welded to the stock, forcing her eye to look through the tiny iron aperture, riding the recoil straight back. Leaving the barrel, the 220-grain hollow-point boat-tail projectile was traveling at roughly 2,800 feet per second. It was a perfectly machined piece of copper and lead, entering a chaotic world of atmospheric drag. The physics took over. Gravity immediately began clawing at the bullet, pulling it downward at 32 feet per second squared. Drag bled its velocity. By the time it crossed the 600-meter mark, it was bleeding speed exponentially, screaming through the thin, hot air. Wind slammed into its right flank. A sheer 15-mile-an-hour gale pushing the heavy projectile steadily leftward across the ruined cityscape. On the roof, time dilated. Donovan was locked onto the eyepiece of his spotting scope. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He was watching the trace, the visible ripple in the air, a tiny, spiraling vortex of disturbed mirage that trailed behind the bullet like a phantom wake in the water. "Trace," Donovan whispered, his voice trembling with an adrenaline he hadn't felt in a decade. "Trace is high. It's too high." 1 second. The bullet crossed the 800-meter mark. It was currently arcing 50 feet above the ground, flying over the hollowed-out roofs of the slum, completely silent to the men it was approaching because it was still outpacing the speed of sound. 2 seconds. 1,200 meters. The bullet began its terminal descent. Gravity was winning. The parabolic arc steepened, dropping like a stone thrown from a cliff. The wind had shoved it a full 10 feet to the left of where Casey's barrel was actually pointing. 3 seconds. Through the spotting scope, Donovan watched the broker shove the kneeling DEA agent toward the open door of the armored SUV. The target's hand was on the agent's collar. The broker opened his mouth to shout an order to the driver. He never finished the syllable. The kinetic transfer was absolute. There was no theatrical backward flight. The bullet, now traveling just above subsonic speed, struck the broker perfectly in the center of his sternum. The impact shattered the clavicle and the thoracic spine, exiting the back in a massive blowout of pressurized tissue. The broker simply folded. His knees gave out instantly, his central nervous system severed. He dropped like a sack of wet sand, collapsing onto the baking dust of the courtyard. A split second later, the delayed crack boom of the rifle shot washed over the compound. "Impact!" Donovan gasped. He pulled his eye from the glass, staring at Casey through the swirling dust. His face was pale beneath the grease paint and grime. "Center mass. Target is down. Target is neutralized." Casey didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She ran the bolt, the heavy steel action ejecting the smoking brass casing into the dirt, and shoved another round into the chamber. Down in the courtyard, chaos erupted. The guards stared at their dead boss, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the strike. They looked at the surrounding buildings, but the angle of the wound channel made no sense to them. The shot had fallen from the sky. The hostage didn't wait. The DEA agent kicked backward, sliding beneath the heavy steel undercarriage of the Toyota SUV, wedging himself behind the tire. "Vulture, this is Assault Command. We copy target down. We are breaking the roadblock now. Stand by for breach." The radio chatter was a welcome sound, but Casey and Donovan didn't have time to process it. The enemy fighters on the adjacent rooftop, the ones who had fired the RPG, realized the sniper team was still alive. Automatic fire chewed into the lip of their parapet. A burst of 7.62mm rounds walked a tight line across the tar paper, kicking up chunks of debris that showered over Casey's legs. "We gotta move!" Donovan roared, grabbing his M4 and returning fire. He dumped a 30-round magazine into the opposing building, suppressing the gunner just long enough to grab Casey's harness. Casey slung the heavy sniper rifle over her back. The iron sights dug into her spine. "Stairwell!" she yelled. They scrambled backward, crab walking across the blistering roof until they reached the rusted iron door of the access stairs. Donovan kicked it open, throwing a flashbang down the dark concrete shaft. Bang! The overpressure rattled their teeth. They plunged into the darkness, boots echoing on the stairs. Dust choked the air, smelling of ancient garbage and fresh explosive residue. They took the stairs two at a time, clearing the landings. On the third floor, a fighter stepped out of a doorway, raising a battered AK. Donovan didn't hesitate. 2 rounds to the chest, 1 to the head. The man crumpled. "Clear!" Donovan shouted, stepping over the body. They reached the ground floor just as the earth began to vibrate. It wasn't an explosion. It was the synchronized heavy rumble of diesel engines. Outside the tenement, the cinder block wall facing the street exploded inward. A heavily armored Stryker vehicle smashed through the barrier, its .50 caliber turret rotating methodically, laying down a suppressing curtain of fire that shredded the adjacent buildings. The cavalry was here. Rangers spilled out of the back of the Stryker, stacking on the doorways, securing the perimeter with brutal, practiced efficiency. "Vulture 1-1, coming out!" Donovan yelled, shoving the front door open with his boot, his hands raised slightly so the perimeter guards wouldn't light them up. A Ranger platoon leader jogged up to them, his eyes scanning the rooftops. "You guys good?" "We're intact," Donovan panted, leaning against the Stryker's armor. "Status of the package?" "Secured," the Ranger said. Assault element breached the courtyard right after the target dropped. The guards routed. Hostage is battered but alive. He's already loaded in the medevac. The Ranger looked at Casey, then at the heavy rifle slung across her back. He noticed the bare rail. "Where's your glass?" "Blown out by an RPG," Casey said simply. Her throat was so dry it hurt to speak. The Ranger frowned, looking back towards the compound, almost a mile away. "If your glass was blown out, who took the shot on the HVT?" Donovan looked at Casey. He looked at the dust caked into her sweat, the bruise already forming on her jaw from the recoil, and the calm, steady rhythm of her breathing. The cynicism that had defined him for a decade was entirely gone, burned away by what he had just witnessed. "She did," Donovan said quietly. "Iron sights." The Ranger stared at them, trying to process the geometry, the distance, and the absolute absurdity of the claim. He shook his head. Bullshit. Donovan didn't argue. He just uncapped his canteen, took a swig, and handed it to Casey. Drink, he said softly. This time she took it. The forward operating base was a plywood city, bathed in the harsh, flat glare of halogen floodlights. The air smelled of burning diesel and latrine chemicals, the universal perfume of the war on terror. Casey sat on the edge of her cot in the transient tent. The adrenaline had completely metabolized, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. Every muscle in her back felt like it had been beaten with a tire iron. The bruise on her shoulder was a vibrant, mottled purple. The door flap rustled. Donovan ducked inside. He didn't say anything at first. He walked over to the folding table where Casey had laid out her gear. The Mark 13 was stripped down, resting on a cleaning mat. The shattered Schmidt and Bender scope sat next to it, a useless, twisted hunk of aluminum and broken glass. Donovan picked up the broken scope. He turned it over in his heavy hands, listening to the loose glass rattle inside the tube. Command debriefed the hostage, Donovan said, his voice low. Casey ran a patch down the bore of the barrel, and the broker was about to give the order to execute him. You had maybe a half second before the blade went to work. Donovan set the scope down. The brass is throwing a fit over the hold fire violation, but JSOC command overrode them. You saved the agent's life. The video never got made. The network is fractured. Casey squirted a few drops of CLP oil onto the bolt face. Good. They pulled the bullet from the dirt, Donovan continued. He leaned against the plywood wall, crossing his arms. 1,412 meters. Wind was gusting at 16 miles an hour, with iron sights, no magnification. Casey didn't look up. The dope card was accurate. Donovan let out a short, breathy laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor, born entirely of disbelief. Casey, you aimed at the clouds. You aimed into the wind blindly. You pulled the trigger on a prayer. Casey stopped cleaning the rifle. She looked up at Donovan. Her eyes were hard, anchored in a reality that had nothing to do with luck or divine intervention. It wasn't a prayer, Donnie, she said quietly. It was physics. The bullet has a ballistic coefficient. It has mass. It has velocity. The earth has gravity. The wind exerts a specific force over distance. The barrel was aligned perfectly to intersect those variables. She picked up the bolt, sliding it smoothly back into the receiver with a sharp, metallic clack. People lie, Casey said, staring at the gun. Intel lies, cameras lie, egos get people killed. But the math is pure. You just have to trust it when you can't see the target. Donovan stared at her for a long time. The heavy silence of the tent was only broken by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a Black Hawk helicopter taking off from the flight line. He slowly walked over to the table. He didn't mock her. He didn't throw out a sarcastic quip. He reached out and tapped the tiny metal backup iron sight flipped up on the rear of the rail. I'll order you a new scope in the morning, he said. Make sure it's a good one, Casey replied, resting the rifle against the cot. Iron sights give me a headache. Donovan nodded once, a gesture of absolute, unshakable respect. He turned and walked out of the tent, leaving her alone in the quiet. Casey laid back on the scratchy wool blanket. She closed her eyes. She didn't see the desert. She didn't see the blood or the dust or the chaos of the rooftop. She saw the arc, the invisible, perfect line cutting through the sky, a tether of physics and force, connecting a broken rifle to a fleeting target. The scope was gone. The chance was mathematically microscopic, but she had taken it anyway, because in a world governed by chaos, someone had to pull the trigger. If this story of impossible odds, raw grit, and absolute precision hit home for you, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button to honor the quiet professionals who hold the line in the darkest corners of the world. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the mind is the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. And make sure to subscribe for more grounded, visceral stories from the front lines. The math never lies. We'll see you next time.